So good morning everyone, students. Hope everyone is comfortable. So today we are going to see the basis and rationale of biochemical tests in different diseases, the continuation of the previous session. So today we are going to see renal failure, nephrotic syndrome, proteinuria edema, gout, pancreatitis, dyslipidemia and disorders of acid-base balance. So we know patient comes with symptoms, we'll do the general examination and systemic examination and we'll come to a provisional diagnosis. We'll send the patient for investigations and we'll come to final diagnosis and we'll give the treatment. So renal failure, it is significant loss of renal function in both kidneys. It can be acute or chronic. So what are the renal functions? What are the functions of kidneys? The removal of waste products. So different waste metabolic products are formed in different metabolisms. These are removed by the kidney. And next one is the homeostasis. It will maintain the electrolyte fluid balance and acid-base balance. And apart from that, retention. So reabsorption of some electrolytes and biochemical substances is done by the kidney. And apart from that, hormonal function. We know calcitriol, vitamin D is synthesized in the kidney, which acts like a hormone, and also renin is produced in the kidney. So these are the functions of the kidney. So when there is significant loss in any of these functions, then it is known as renal failure. Significant loss means more than 80% loss of these functions denotes renal failure. So it can be acute or chronic depending upon the causes. So coming to the basics, we know the cut section of kidney shows the outer part cortex and inner medulla, and the functional unit of the kidney is nephron, which partly lies in the cortex and partly in the medulla, and nephron is the filtering unit of the kidney. And nephron contains a glomerulus and a proximal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule which connects to the collecting duct. So coming to the glomerulus, the main function of the glomerulus is filtration. The filtering unit of kidney is glomerulus. So here you can see the arterioles and efferent and afferent arterioles through which the blood comes and goes out through the glomerulus. So inside the glomerulus, the filtration occurs in the cluster of blood vessels. So glomerulus is mainly meant for the filtration. And apart from glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule, they help in reabsorption and secretion, which is connected to the collecting duct. And these are lined by the epithelium. And urine formation. We know the formation of urine involves filtration, which occurs in glomerulus, reabsorption, which occurs in proximal convoluted tubule, and secretion, which occurs in the distal convoluted tubule. So from here it is secreted to the collecting duct, and from where the urine is excreted through renal pelvis and ureters. So this is the normal process that is occurring. And in some diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure, which are chronic diseases, and kidney trauma and toxic exposure like acute conditions, there will be renal failure. So renal failure means the loss of functions, significant loss of functions, that is approximately more than 80% loss of the functions leads to renal failure. So in renal failure, we know the excretion function is the first affected. So different metabolic waste products which are formed in different metabolism can't be excreted out and they will be accumulated. So when these metabolic waste products are accumulated, they will interact with all the metabolisms and it leads to disruption of different metabolic functions. And in renal failure, we know electrolyte excretion is also affected, is decreased, which leads to fluid electrolyte imbalance and acid-base disturbances. So these are the things, these are the disturbances which are occurring in renal failure, which leads to different signs and symptoms. So these are different signs and symptoms in renal failure by which the patient comes to us and we will diagnose the renal failure. So renal failure, first we do the renal function test, blood urea, serum creatinine, serum electrolytes like sodium, potassium and chloride, serum calcium and phosphate, urine electrolytes, urine analysis and glomerular filtration rate. These are the tests done for diagnosing and categorizing the renal failure. So the first test is urea. Coming to urea, we know the urea is the end product of protein metabolism. So which is formed by urea cycle. So when this urea is not eliminated by kidneys, it leads to increased urea levels in the blood, which is known as uremia. So this urea will interact with different protein metabolism and leads to different toxic effects in renal failure. So the normal range is 15 to 40 milligram per deciliter. So creatinine is the next one, which is formed from creatine, which is present in the muscle. So creatine is present in the muscle in the form of creatine phosphate. So this phosphate is necessary for formation of ATP, which is required for the contraction of muscle. So when this phosphate is used, this creatine is spontaneously converted to creatinine. So this creatinine, the excretion of creatinine is also affected in the renal failure and it leads to increased creatinine levels in the blood. The normal range is 0.4 to 1.4 milligram per deciliter. Next, coming to electrolytes, sodium excretion is decreased. So when sodium is retained, it causes fluid retention. So due to which the fluid overload occurs and hypernatremia occurs. The normal range is 135 to 145 milliequivalents per liter. So potassium excretion is also decreased, which leads to accumulation of potassium in the blood, which is hyperkalemia. The normal range is 3.5 to 5 milliequivalents per liter. And chloride levels are not much varied in renal failure. So why this sodium is decreased, hyponatremia is occurring in the renal failure? There are two reasons. One is when there is sodium retention, that is sodium is retained, it leads to retention of the fluids. So more amount of fluid is also retained and the sodium will get diluted, which leads to hyponatremia. Whereas potassium, it does not cause any fluid retention, so it goes to hyperkalemia state. And one more reason is we know why this sodium is more affecting due to this fluid overload, because we know the sodium is present more extracellularly. So that's why when there is fluid retention along with the sodium, the extracellular sodium will be more affected. Okay? So here we know that sodium is present more extracellularly. So that's why this fluid overload will affect on the sodium, which leads to hyponatremia. Whereas potassium is present more intracellularly. So that's why the fluid overload effect on potassium is less. That's why we will see hyponatremia and hyperkalemia in the renal failure. And coming to the calcium, we know calcium excretion is also decreased in the renal failure. But in renal failure, there is decreased vitamin D synthesis, so which is necessary for production of calcium, formation of calcium. So that's why in renal failure, when there is decreased vitamin D synthesis, it leads to hypocalcemia. The normal range is 8 to 10 milligram per deciliter. And phosphorus excretion is decreased and directly it leads to hyperphosphatemia. So the normal range is 3 to 4.5 milligram per deciliter. So in calcium and phosphorus, the calcium is decreased leading to hypokalemia and phosphorus is increased leading to hyperphosphatemia. So we'll do the complete urine analysis to see the underlying cause, and urine electrolytes are also measured, sodium, potassium and chloride. So as in the renal failure, the excretion of the electrolytes is decreased. So the urine levels of the electrolytes will be decreased than the normal ranges. So generally the urine parameters are measured the amount per day. So that's why in renal failure, the urine electrolytes will be decreased per day. And GFR, glomerular filtration rate, that is the rate at which a substance is cleared from the plasma in unit time by glomerulus. So the normal range is 90 to 120 ml per minute, and this GFR is used for categorizing the renal failure. So here you can see the stages of renal failure as per the glomerular filtration rate. As the glomerular filtration rate decreases, the stage will be increased. That means when the kidney is keeping going on damage, the glomerular filtration rate will be decreased. So depending upon this GFR, we can categorize the renal failure, kidney disease. And to see the underlying causes, we'll do all other tests, and to plan the treatment, we'll do all the tests. Because we know the first line of treatment is for the diagnosis, and the other investigations are to know the underlying cause, to see the complications, and for planning the treatment. So all the levels, the urea, creatinine, all are measured in semi-auto analyzer and fully auto analyzer. And electrolytes, both urine and serum electrolytes are measured in electrolyte analyzer. So coming to treatment, as there is fluid retention, we have to correct the fluids. And as there is decreased excretion of the electrolytes, there is electrolyte imbalance, and we have to correct the electrolyte imbalance. And there is decreased excretion of waste products, so we'll do the dialysis, by which the waste products and excess of electrolytes will be excreted. And the follow-up is done by the investigations. After treatment, we'll do the follow-up, which is by the investigations. Renal function test in case of renal failure. So, for understanding, the most common systematic disease causing end-stage renal failure. This is important because this is the leading cause of renal failure, which is going up to the end stage. So obviously the answer will be diabetes mellitus. This is the common cause leading to the nephropathy, which leads to the end stage renal failure. So next we had seen the renal failure. So the next is the nephrotic syndrome. It is a glomerular disease characterized by proteinuria. So glomerular, we know glomerulus is the filtering unit of the kidney. So when there is any defect in the glomerulus, that is in glomerular disease, the filtration will be affected. So when filtration is affected, it leads to excretion of the proteins, proteinuria. So proteinuria is the important thing, and proteinuria leads to the hypoalbuminemia, edema, and hyperlipidemia. So in nephrotic syndrome, proteinuria is important, loss of proteins. And the loss of proteins in the nephrotic syndrome is a large amount of proteins. If small amount of proteins are excreted in urine, it is not known as nephrotic syndrome. Only when a large amount of proteins are excreted, that is greater than 3 to 3.5 grams per day are excreted, then that is known as nephrotic syndrome. The nephrotic range of excretion of proteins is only known as nephrotic syndrome. That means excretion of large amount of proteins, that is greater than 3 to 3.5 grams per day. And this nephrotic syndrome can be due to primary causes or secondary causes. Primary causes means directly the disease of the glomerulus. And in secondary causes, some other disease will cause the secondary effect on the kidneys and the glomerulus. That is secondary causes. So the common primary cause for nephrotic syndrome is focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. So this is a disease in which the sclerosis of the glomeruli occur at certain sections or certain segments. That's why this is known as focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. So here you can see there are a cluster of vessels in the glomerulus. So a certain part of this blood vessels will get sclerosed. So when that part of the glomerulus is sclerosed, automatically the filtration will be affected. So this part is affected here in this picture. So that part of the glomerulus is sclerosed. That segment of the glomerulus or that segment of the cluster of blood vessels is sclerosed. So the filtration will be affected. And in the secondary causes or like diabetes and hypertension, it will give a secondary effect to the renal damage of the glomerulus, nephropathy. So in that case also there is damage to the kidney and the glomerulus, and the filtration will be affected. Finally, the filtration will be affected, which leads to proteinuria, nephrotic range of proteinuria. So here there will be damage to the cluster of blood vessels in the glomerulus or damage to the complete glomerulus, which leads to defective filtration and nephrotic proteinuria, that is greater than 3 to 3.5 grams per day. So nephrotic syndrome, the main thing here is proteinuria, excretion of proteins, large amount of proteins in the urine, and this proteinuria leads to hypoalbuminemia, edema, and hyperlipidemia. So coming to hypoalbuminemia, hypoalbuminemia means the decreased albumin levels in the blood. Okay. So in proteinuria, a large amount of proteins are lost in the urine, and we know almost 50% of the proteins in the plasma are consist of albumins. So that's why when there is loss of proteins, obviously a large number of albumins will be lost in the urine. So that's why the albumin levels in the blood will be decreased, which is known as hypoalbuminemia. So that's why proteinuria leads to hypoalbuminemia. Coming to edema. So what is edema? Edema is accumulation of excess fluid in the body tissue is known as edema. Okay. So here we can see in blood vessels there is hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. There will be a balance, equilibrium between the hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. When hydrostatic pressure is increased, the fluid will goes out into the tissues. So when osmotic pressure is increased, the fluid comes inside. Okay, but an equilibrium is maintained generally in a healthy individual. An equilibrium is maintained between the hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure in the blood vessel, and this osmotic pressure is due to albumin. So in proteinuria, when there is loss of albumin, albumin will be decreased. So this osmotic pressure will be decreased. So relatively, this hydrostatic pressure will be increased, which leads to outflow of the fluids. So outflow of these fluids will accumulate in the tissues, which is nothing but the edema. So these fluids will accumulate in the tissues, which is edema. So in this way, proteinuria is leading to hypoalbuminemia, which is leading to edema by decreasing the osmotic pressure and outflow of the fluids. So this is the mechanism of edema in nephrotic syndrome. And coming to hyperlipidemia, hyperlipidemia is nothing but increased lipid levels in the blood. So this hyperalbuminemia, we know this is causing the decreased osmotic pressure or oncotic pressure, and as the reaction to this decreased oncotic pressure, there is hepatic lipogenesis by different mechanisms. So this hepatic lipogenesis is leading to the hyperlipidemia. So in this way, proteinuria is causing hypoalbuminemia by excretion of more number of albumins, and edema by decreasing the oncotic pressure and by fluid outflow, and hyperlipidemia by causing hepatic lipogenesis. And all these things happens, which finally results in the symptoms and signs of the nephrotic syndrome. And with this, the patient comes to us and we will diagnose it as nephrotic syndrome. So as this is a renal disease, we will do the routine renal function test, the blood urea, the serum creatinine, and serum electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and chloride. Apart from this, the serum albumin is measured because we will see decreased albumin levels, hypoalbuminemia in the nephrotic syndrome. And we will measure the lipid profile because we will see the hyperlipidemia in the nephrotic syndrome. And we will measure 24 hours urine protein. This is very important because in 24 hours urine protein only we can assess how much protein is being lost in the urine. Then only we can confirm whether the protein loss is in the nephrotic range or less than the nephrotic range. So that's why 24 hours urine protein estimation is very important in the diagnosis of nephrotic syndrome. And we'll measure the urine protein creatinine ratio to check the excretion of protein. So serum albumin, if it is less than 2.5 grams per deciliter, we can suspect nephrotic syndrome. And 24 hours urine protein, which is very important. If it is more than 3 or 3.5 grams per day, then we can suspect, that is, if it is in nephrotic range, then we can suspect nephrotic syndrome. Generally, it will be very less than 100 milligram per deciliter. And urine protein creatinine ratio also helps us in the diagnosis of nephrotic syndrome. And total cholesterol, however, hyperlipidemia, if increased beyond 350 milligram per deciliter, it suggests the nephrotic syndrome. So in this way, by combining the renal function test and all these tests, we can confirm the diagnosis of nephrotic syndrome. And to see the underlying causes, we'll do all the other relevant tests. And for planning treatment, we'll do all the imaging techniques and biopsy, and we'll plan the treatment. So treatment includes medication and dialysis. And after completion of treatment, again we'll follow up by doing the investigations. Most commonly, the first investigation is 24 hours urine protein. So we have, for understanding, the characteristic features of nephrotic syndrome are heavy proteinuria greater than 3 grams per 24 hours, hypoalbuminemia less than 2.5 grams per deciliter, edema, hyperlipidemia, and all the above. So we had seen all these. So the answer is all the above. Okay, we know heavy proteinuria is there, greater than 3 grams per 24 hours. Then only it is known as nephrotic syndrome. And hyperalbuminemia, as proteins are excreted, more number of albumin is present in the proteins. Major part of the proteins is constituted by albumin. So there will be loss of the albumin, which leads to hyperalbuminemia. When there is a loss of albumin, oncotic pressure in the blood vessels will be decreased. There will be relative increase of the hydrostatic pressure, which leads to outflow of the fluids. And these fluids will get accumulated in different tissues, which leads to edema. And due to this hyperalbuminemia and decreased osmotic pressure, the hepatic lipogenesis occurs, which leads to hyperlipidemia. So all these are present in the nephrotic syndrome. So next is the proteinuria. So characterized by presence of greater amounts of protein in urine. So we had seen the proteinuria in renal disease, nephrotic syndrome. But proteinuria can also occur in other diseases also, not only in the renal diseases. So proteinuria can occur in the renal diseases due to damage to the renal blood vessels, or proteinuria can occur in other conditions also due to increased blood flow in the renal vessels. So here you can see in some conditions like fever, stress, strenuous exercise, acute illness, there will be increased blood flow in the kidneys, that is increased renal blood flow. This is due to sympathetic stimulation and vasodilatation of the renal blood vessels. So this also leads to excretion of proteins, proteinuria. And in renal diseases like focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, diabetes, and hypertension, we know there is directly damage to the blood vessels of the glomeruli or glomeruli, which leads to damage to the renal blood vessels, and the filtration will be affected, and this also leads to the excretion of proteins, proteinuria. So types of proteinuria, depending upon the formation, it is divided into glomerular, tubular, and overflow. In glomerular, the defect in the glomerulus, the defect in the filtration, due to which the proteins will be increased. And in tubular, the defect is in the tubules, the proximal and distal convoluted tubules, due to which there is increased excretion and decreased reabsorption, which also leads to the proteinuria. and overflow. There is overproduction of the proteins. In that case also, proteins will be excreted in urine, leading to proteinuria. So these are the types. And due to proteinuria, we will get different symptoms. The patient will be getting different symptoms and he will come to us. And by biochemical investigations, we will classify the proteinuria and we'll check the underlying cause of the proteinuria. Okay. So here also, as it is proteinuria, the first investigation is 24-hour urine protein, by which we can check the range of proteinuria, whether it is whether it is mild, moderate, or severe, whether it is in nephrotic range or not in the nephrotic range. And we will see the albumins, because in proteinuria there will be loss of albumins in the urine and decreased albumin in the blood. And lipid profile, due to proteinuria, we know there is hyperlipidemia due to decreased oncotic pressure, hepatic lipogenesis. So that's why we'll check the lipid profile also. And apart from that, we'll do the routine renal function test, as proteinuria is related to the kidneys. So by 24 hours urinary protein, we'll categorize the proteinuria as mild, moderate, or severe depending upon the protein excreted, whether it is less than 500 milligrams or in between 500 to 2000 milligrams or greater than 2000 milligrams or 2 grams per day. That means 24 hours urine means per day. So depending upon which we can categorize the proteinuria so that we can plan the treatment. And we know by using the multi-strips and chemi-strips, we can categorize the proteinuria as 1+, 2+, 3+, 4+, depending upon the protein excreted in the urine. In this way also, we can classify or categorize the proteinuria. And after categorizing, we will do all the relevant investigations. The first layer of investigations to check the proteinuria and the type of proteinuria, and to see the underlying cause, we'll do the other relevant tests and imaging techniques, and we'll detect the underlying cause and we'll plan a proper treatment. So treatment is nothing but the underlying cause, and the follow-up is the investigation. Okay, mainly assessing the proteinuria. Next is edema. Edema, we know it is nothing but accumulation of excess fluid in the body tissue. That leads to swelling. That is edema. So body fluids are maintained by different mechanisms in the body, and these mechanisms are disturbed in different diseases. So when these mechanisms are disturbed, there will be accumulation of the fluid leading to the edema. So edema can be caused by cardiovascular diseases, renal diseases, hepatic diseases, and lymphatic diseases. In all the diseases, there can be accumulation of fluid in the tissues, which can lead to edema. So edema, there are different mechanisms. We know when the hydrostatic pressure is increased, then there will be, when directly the hydrostatic pressure is increased, it leads to outflow of the fluids, which leads to edema. And when there is osmotic pressure is decreased, when osmotic pressure is decreased, there is relative increase of the hydrostatic pressure. So in such case also, there will be fluid outflow and accumulation leading to edema. And apart from that, inflammation. In inflammation also, there will be increase of hydrostatic pressure, which leads to outflow and edema. And in sodium and water retention also, more amount of water is retained, which is accumulated in the tissues, which leads to edema. So in this way, the different mechanisms are there for different diseases for formation of edema or accumulation of fluid in the tissues. Due to this, the patient will come with different symptoms and will assess the edema. Okay. The first assess the edema by physical examination only, and apart from that, the biochemical examination, the biochemical investigations which help the edema are renal function test, lipid profile, liver function test, serum albumin, cardiovascular investigations, and 24-hour protein. So by using all these tests, we can assess the edema and we can see the underlying cause. We can check the underlying cause of the edema. So by other investigations also, by imaging techniques and venography, by all this we can check the underlying cause and we can plan the treatment for edema. So the treatment is treating the underlying cause, which is the main causative thing, which is the responsible for accumulation of fluid, and follow-up is by the investigations. And here you can see the edema patient before getting the edema and after getting edema. You can see a lot of difference, the swelling of different tissues in the edema. Next is the gout. So you had already seen the gout. Gout is nothing but increased levels of serum uric acid due to increased production or decreased excretion. So in both the cases, the uric acid levels will be accumulated in the blood and they will be increased and they cause different effects. So that is known as gout. So uric acid levels increase is the main abnormality in the gout. So coming to uric acid, the normal mechanism, uric acid production excretion. We know the nucleotides, from nucleotides we'll get the purines. That is uric acid is the end product of purine metabolism, we know. So these purines are degraded to form hypoxanthine, xanthine, and finally uric acid. So this uric acid is excreted in the urine. So this is the normal thing that is happening. But in case of gout, what happens is the uric acid is not excreted properly and the uric acid will be accumulated in the joints, which is known as gout. And if there is more production of uric acid due to degradation of these nucleotides, then also it leads to accumulation of uric acids and gout. So in different conditions like lifestyle and other medical conditions and also hereditary conditions, this overproduction or decreased excretion of uric acid may occur. And we know there is primary and secondary gout. Primary is directly due to enzyme defect, which generally occurs in the hereditary diseases. And secondary occurs due to some other medical conditions. So coming to the mechanism of gout, there is under excretion and overproduction of uric acid, which leads to hyperuricemia. So this hyperuricemia leads to formation of urate crystals. This uric acid, which is increased in blood, will combine with the sodium and form sodium uric acid crystals. Okay, these crystals will interact with the inflammatory system. That means infiltration of granulocytes and generation of free radicals occurs. Okay, and this leads to gout and clinical features in the gout. Commonly, the features are the important features are the swelling and the inflamed joint. Swelling and the inflammation are the common symptoms which we see in the gout. Common symptoms and the signs which we see in the gout are due to accumulation of uric acid crystals. So the patient comes to us and will diagnose the gout by assessing the serum uric acid levels, urine uric acid levels, and blood urea and blood creatinine are also estimated, because the uric acid is also excreted through the kidneys. So if there is any damage to the kidney, then uric acid levels can also be accumulated. That's why we will check the renal functions, urea and creatinine. Okay. So if uric acid levels are increased, then we can suspect gout. And similarly, if uric acid levels are decreased in urine, then also it indicates the gout. And if it is not properly diagnosed at earlier stage, the gout leads to the complications, formation of tophi, which is accumulated in joints and which leads to restriction and pain in the joint movements. And when these uric acid crystals are accumulated more and more in the kidney, it leads to kidney damage. It accumulates in the kidney and finally leads to the renal stones. Uric acid stones are formed in the kidney. So here you can see the accumulation of uric acid in the joints. Mostly the distal joints are commonly involved. So there will be pain and restriction of movement in the joints. Initially the joint movement will be free, but when these crystals are accumulated, see, after distal joints, these crystals are also accumulated in the proximal joints. So the movements will be restricted and there will be pain and inflammation in the joints. And in still further complicated cases, the uric acid will be accumulated in the kidneys, which leads to formation of uric acid stones in the kidneys. So we will see the underlying cause and we'll give the treatment. We'll plan the treatment depending upon the underlying cause, whether it is primary gout or secondary gout, whether it is hereditary or due to some other disease, secondary to some other disease. So we'll see all the things and we'll plan the treatment. So treatment is, as in gout, there is inflammation and swelling, there is a lot of pain. So we'll give the pain relieving and prevent the complications. We know the complications, the formation of tophi, restriction of the joint movements, and renal stones are the complications. So we'll treat the complications also. And follow-up is by the investigations, the routine checkup of the serum uric acid levels. So for understanding, a patient with gout has recently started medication allopurinol and is undergoing dose titration. So what laboratory tests should be monitored at the monthly follow-up visit during this period? Dose titration means he's just adjusting the dose of the medication for the treatment of gout. So what should be the laboratory test? So we know the gout is morely concerned with the uric acid levels and more of the uric acid, serum uric acid levels. So the answer is B, serum urate or serum uric acid level, depending upon which the dose will be adjusted and the patient will continue the dose of the for the gout, dose of allopurinol or any medication for the gout. And coming to the pancreatitis. We know the inflammation of pancreas is known as pancreatitis. It can be acute or chronic. So we know pancreas is an organ which is present in the abdomen. It contains alpha and beta cells and it secretes some enzymes and hormones like insulin and glucagon. And pancreas, we know the function of pancreas, it secretes the enzymes which along with the bile enters the intestine and helps in the digestion. But in different conditions, different risk factors like alcohol consumption, high fat diet, overweight, tobacco production, and due to some genetic factors, this leads to pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreatitis, that is known as pancreatitis. It can be acute or chronic depending upon the cause. Acute means the pancreatitis inflammation occurs suddenly and suddenly the patient complains with the pain. And chronic means it takes a long time and the patient will come with inflammation of pancreas after a long time of inflammation. Okay, it generally occurs in the hereditary condition, chronic alcoholics, and high triglyceride levels. And acute occurs in renal, gallstones, in medication or in poisoning, and in alcohol and in infections. So in this way, pancreatitis can occur in acute or chronic conditions. And the patient comes with mainly with the abdominal pain, and we will diagnose the pancreatitis by the following investigations: serum amylase, serum lipase, urine amylase, and also liver function tests are also done. So coming to the serum amylase, it will increase in 6 to 12 hours after the pancreatitis and remains elevated for 3 to 5 days. Here, the important thing is when the amylase levels are increased 3 times, when there is 3 times elevation, then we can suspect some pancreatitis. So 3 times elevation is significant here, which makes us approach the diagnosis of the pancreatitis. So the normal range is 28 to 100 units per deciliter. And urine amylase is important because when amylase levels are increased in blood, then the urine levels will also be increased. But urine levels are more sensitive because these levels, the serum amylase levels will come to normal within 3 to 5 days. But urine amylase levels will be still elevated even after that. That's why these are more sensitive than the serum amylase levels. And we know the amylase is the enzyme, pancreatic enzyme, which helps in the digestion of carbohydrates. This is present in the pancreas. So when there is any injury to the pancreas, amylase will be released into the blood. So that's why we'll check the amylase. When 3 times it is increased, it is significant for pancreatitis. And normal ranges, you can follow any standard book for the normal ranges. And coming to serum lipase, it is raised after 12 hours, but it remains elevated for more days than the serum amylase. It is more specific to the pancreas. That means the increase of lipase in other conditions is very rare. It is more specific to the pancreas. The normal range is 40 units per liter. So underlying cause and for planning the treatment, we will do the all other tests, relevant investigations, because we have to know the underlying cause for pancreatitis. Then we can plan the treatment. So coming to the case, which of the following tests should be reviewed to work up a patient for pancreatitis? So what are the investigations that are done in a patient of pancreatitis who approaches us with the pancreatitis? So that means when a patient comes to us with abdominal pain, then we can suspect pancreatitis and we will send to the investigations. If we suspect pancreatitis, then to which investigations we have to send the patient for? Amylase, calcium, hemoglobin, lipase, amylase, triglycerides, hemoglobin, glucose, ALT, lipase, magnesium, serum calcium, lipase, and CRP. So what are the investigations that we have to send the patient for? So this we had already seen. We know amylase, lipase, and triglycerides, because lipase is very specific and amylase is the early marker which is increased in within 6 to 12 hours, and urine amylase is more sensitive, and triglycerides also we will see in the chronic pancreatitis. So that's why lipase, amylase, triglycerides are sent if we suspect pancreatitis. Next is the dyslipidemia, abnormal amounts of lipids in the blood. We know in the normal cholesterol metabolism, cholesterol is moved from liver to the peripheral tissues by the LDL, and from peripheral tissues by the liver by the HDL, which is also assisted by the LCAT. Okay, this is the normal mechanism. So when there is any disturbance in this normal lipid metabolism, it leads to lipid abnormalities. Okay, dyslipidemia. So hyperlipoproteinemia is also a dyslipidemia, in which different, this is a hereditary conditions. There is a classification also in which different the components of the lipid profile will be increased and decreased depending upon the condition. Okay, so that's why we'll assess the lipid profile. So for the diagnosis of dyslipidemias, that is increased or decreased lipids in the blood, we'll assess the lipid profile: total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, VLDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. So these are the normal ranges. If there is any abnormality, then we can diagnose it as dyslipidemias. So next is the acid-base disorders. So acid-base disorders we had already seen in the recent classes, previous classes. So we know there are 3 mechanisms for maintenance of acid-base balance in the body. The first line is chemical mechanism, chemical buffers or blood buffers. There is a first line and immediate response is given by the first line. And the second line is respiratory regulation of acid-base balance. This is a short-term mechanism for regulation. And the third line is renal mechanism. This is the long-term mechanism for regulation of acid-base balance in the body, in the blood. So when there is in different diseases, when these mechanisms are affected, then it leads to disturbance in the acid-base balance, which leads to variation of pH. Okay, whether it is acidosis or alkalosis. So in different conditions, we can see the acidosis and alkalosis. It can be metabolic acidosis or metabolic respiratory alkalosis. So metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis, respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, depending upon different conditions. Okay. And due to this, the patient will be getting different symptoms and patient will come for the investigation, diagnosis. We will send the patient for the diagnosis and we will diagnose the acid-base disorder by arterial blood gas analysis. So arterial blood gas analysis includes the acidity, pH, and the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the terms of partial pressures. Partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of carbon dioxide are measured, and bicarbonate levels are measured. So all these are measured to diagnose the type of acid-base disorder. So generally the blood is taken from the veins, but in case of arterial blood gas analysis, the blood is collected from the artery. So collection of arterial blood is a painful process, and after collecting the blood, we will check for these parameters. So arterial blood gas analyzer will be there. So if we send the sample in the analyzer, we will get the values of these parameters. So depending upon these values, we will differentiate the acid-base disorder. So the normal ranges of pH is 7.35 to 7.45, and partial pressures of carbon dioxide is 35 to 45, and oxygen is 80 to 110 mm of Hg, and bicarbonate is 22 to 26 millimole per liter, and oxygen saturation is also seen, which is 93 to 98%. So depending upon these, depending upon the values of different parameters in the blood gas analyzer, we will differentiate the acid-base disorders, whether it is metabolic acidosis or alkalosis or respiratory acidosis or alkalosis. Okay. Simply the pH will be decreased in acidosis and in pH will be increased in the alkalosis. And in metabolic conditions, there will be difference in the bicarbonate ions, okay, whether it is decreased or increased depending upon the pH. And in respiratory conditions, there will be difference in the carbon dioxide, whether it is decreased or increased. And also there is vice versa due to secondary response. The primary disturbance occurring is in the bicarbonate in metabolic, and the secondary response is the decrease and increase in the carbon dioxide to compensate the primary disturbance. Similarly, in respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, there will be disturbance in the carbon dioxide, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and the secondary response, that is increase and decrease of the bicarbonates, will compensate the primary disturbance. Okay, so we will see the primary disturbance and the compensatory mechanisms. So depending upon the values of different components in the arterial blood gas analysis, which is done in the arterial blood gas analyzer, we will assess the acid-base disorders. And coming to the treatment, depending upon the disorder, depending upon the pH variation, we will treat the condition, and the follow-up is by the repeated blood gas analysis, arterial blood gas analysis. So for understanding, a person was admitted in a coma. Analysis of arterial blood gas gave the following values, that is partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 16 and bicarbonate is 20, pH is 7.1. What is the underlying acid-base disorder? So here clearly we can see the pH is 7.1, that denotes acidosis, and we can see the primary decrease of the carbon dioxide, and there is compensatory mechanism. So that's why this is metabolic acidosis. So case is metabolic acidosis. So a 45-year-old female with renal failure missed her dialysis and was feeling sick. So what could be the reason? So you had completed the renal failure and also the metabolic disorders. So you can understand this. So in renal failure, what happens is excretion of different acids will be affected. And in renal failure, the reabsorption of the bicarbonate ions is also affected. So what happens? Acids will be accumulated. So it leads to acidosis, and the cause is the metabolic cause. So that's why this is, the defect is in the kidney. So it's a metabolic cause, and the option will be the metabolic acidosis. Okay. So hope you understand the biochemical rationale and biochemical mechanism in all different diseases. So these are the recent advances in the diagnosis of diseases, because diagnosis is very important part, depending upon which we will give the treatment to the patient. Okay, and these are my references, and these are some helpful websites for you for this session. And thank you very much. Thank you all.